Good evening. I'm Howard Husick. I'm the Vice President for Policy Research at the Manhattan Institute, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. Just a small housekeeping note first. If everybody could please turn off your cell phone, we'd appreciate it. And Professor Nasaw would appreciate it. As I said, I'm Vice President for Policy Research at the Manhattan Institute, but I also serve as director of what we call our Social Entrepreneurship Initiative. Since 2001, this program has set out to discover and conduct research regarding new, nonprofit, philanthropically supported organizations serving those in need, and doing so effectively through private and volunteer support. Our annual Social Entrepreneurship Award has recognized more than 30 such organizations, as well as recognizing the donors who've supported them. This year, we are very fortunate that the William E. Simon Foundation has asked us to take our effort in this area a step farther, to provide a forum for reflection, not just on those who spend philanthropic money wisely, and that's plenty, but also on the character of American philanthropy itself, both its tradition and its contemporary form. This evening marks the first in what will be an annual lecture series, the William E. Simon Lecture on Philanthropy and Social Entrepreneurship. And I think there's surely no more important figure on which to focus such a premier lecture than Andrew Carnegie, who, by the way, is mentioned in the Articles of Incorporation of the William E. Simon Foundation and was important to Mr. Simon himself. Carnegie, in many ways, can be said to have invented serious philanthropy in the United States. We continue to live here in New York amongst his charitable successes: the Carnegie Corporation and the Carnegie Endowment, the branch libraries throughout the city whose construction he supported, TIAA-CREF, the corporate descendant of his far-sighted 1918 portable pension plan for teachers, and of course, Carnegie Hall. And there's surely no one better to reflect both on Carnegie and on his influence on his contemporary successors, notably Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, than our speaker this evening, the historian David Nasaw, the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. The study of history has changed a good deal over the past generation, during which we've seen a new emphasis on social history, the lives of average people in the context of larger historical trends. Such work has been a useful and indeed often fascinating complement to previous scholarship which looked at the past more through political and biographical lenses. But still, thankfully, there are still historians who do not shrink from the implicit view that the individual can alter the course of history. David Nasaw has demonstrated an appetite and an acumen for just that sort of history in his two most recent books. His 2000 book, The Chief, The Life of William Randolph Hearst, which was awarded the Bancroft Prize for History, and most recently his biography, Andrew Carnegie, awarded the 2007 New York Historical Society Prize in American History, and named as one of the notable books of the year by the New York Times. The success of that book prompted us to ask Dr. Nasaw to reflect on the relevance of Carnegie and his philosophy of giving to the philanthropy of our own times. It's an honor to introduce our first William E. Simon lecturer, David Nasaw.
Thank you. Okay, I will read in the dark unless someone back there can figure out how to do this. In his first Gospel of Wealth essay, published in 1889, Andrew Carnegie, and he was a Scotsman, so I am not, this is not an affectation. His name is pronounced Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie declared unapologetically and unambiguously that, quote, the aim of the millionaire should be to die poor. And, quote, the man who dies leaving behind him millions of available wealth, which was his to administer during life, will pass away unwept, unhonored, and unsung, no matter to what uses he leaves the dross, which he cannot take with him. Of such as these, the public verdict will then be, the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. Carnegie's manifesto was greeted with silence and scorn, and his exhortations ignored by generations of American millionaires, with a few notable exceptions, the most eloquent of whom might have been William Simon, who in 1998 announced that he was giving away his entire fortune, as Carnegie had, that the mission statement he had written for his foundation was drawn directly from Carnegie's 1889 essay, and that he, like Carnegie, would oversee the process of distributing his wealth. In the decade following Simon's announcement, declarations of fealty to Carnegie's example have become more common, though seldom are they accompanied, as Simon's had been, by pledges to donate his entire fortune to philanthropy. Carnegie's story, unlike that of his Gilded Age contemporaries, was truly one of rags to riches, or rather debts to riches. He did not even own the rags on his back. The Carnegie family arrived in Allegheny City, today part of Pittsburgh, in 1848, owing money to the Dunfermline, Scotland friends who had financed their voyage across the Atlantic. Andra, his little brother Tom, his mother Margaret, and their father William, a failed weaver of fine linen tablecloths, were put up by Margaret's sister in a shack facing the alleyway in what is today the Pittsburgh Steelers parking lot. I spent a lot of time looking for it, and that's as far as I got. Andra was sent to work at the Anchor Cotton Mills, owned by a Scotsman, Mr. Blackstock. He was 13 years of age. He was so tiny that his father had to take a job so that he could walk him to and from work and bring him into the cotton mill. His father soon quit. Andrew stayed. By age 30, he was fabulously wealthy. When, in 1901, he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan, Morgan and the newspapers proclaimed him the richest man in the world. Within a year, he had proudly and voluntarily forfeited that title to Rockefeller. Rockefeller's secret was that he tithed. He gave away a good 10% of his fortune in the beginning, probably around 25% of his fortune to philanthropies. Carnegie gave it all away. Having exchanged his partnership interest in Carnegie Steel for negotiable U.S. Steel 5% gold bonds, he engaged in the last great adventure of his lifetime, giving it all away. It was no simple task to select the causes to which he wanted to contribute, establish the foundations and the trusts, get them chartered, write the mission statements, and choose the wisest men he could find to administer his trusts. By 1910, as he celebrated his 75th birthday, he discovered to his alarm that try as he might, he had not been able to give it all away. He had been defeated in the end by the inexorable workings of compound interest, which relentlessly piled 5% a year on the $226 million in U.S. Steel gold bonds he had stored away in his private bank in Hoboken. The solution, his friend, advisor, and lawyer Elihu Root suggested, was to charter yet another omnibus philanthropic foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and begin depositing in it his remaining millions, and in his will leave the residual amounts after personal benefactions and taxes to the Carnegie Corporation, which Mr. Carnegie did, to the everlasting joy of generations of Carnegie Corporation officials and grantees. The essential question for Carnegie biographers and I would argue for 21st century philanthropists, is why did Carnegie, having spent the first part of his lifetime amassing millions of dollars, feel compelled to give it all away? Past biographers have argued rather persuasively that Carnegie, the son of impoverished, union-organizing chartist weavers in Scotland, gave away his money out of guilt and shame at the methods he had employed in accumulating it. The pivotal motive and moment in his transformation from ruthless industrialist to benevolent philanthropist, according to this interpretation, was the Homestead strike, in which he and Henry Clay Frick violently broke the strike of steelworkers, busted the unions at Homestead with the use of armed Pinkerton guards, thereby removing all obstacles in the path of maximizing profits by eliminating union work rules, lowering wage rates, and increasing work hours to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. In the aftermath of the violence which made the headlines of American and European papers for weeks on end, poor Andrew and his wife Margaret traveled all over Europe, including they went to a vacation in Italy, and they found the Italian newspapers with headlines about Homestead. He could not escape. He had, prior to the strike, won a national reputation for himself as a labor-friendly, progressive employer. He had regularly exhorted his fellow industrialists to recognize the right of working men to join unions. In a matter of weeks in 1892, he was transformed, and his reputation was transformed into the bête noire of Gilded Age labor and politics, the beast who had unleashed Frick, who had unleashed the Pinkertons on his own employees and their families. I began by accepting the traditional interpretation for Carnegie's philanthropy, that he gave away his money out of guilt, shame, and to redeem a place for himself in history. But new evidence pushed me in a different direction. Carnegie, it appeared, had determined long before Homestead that he was going to give away his fortune. How do I know? Well, I was fortunate enough to find his prenuptial agreement, which he and his bride-to-be, Louise Whitfield, signed in the second-floor sitting room of her mother's home right around the corner at 24 West 48th Street. They signed it just before they came downstairs to be married. And in the agreement, which is a wonderful hand-lettered document, Louise Whitfield affirms that, 1, she knew she was marrying a very rich man. 2, she knew that she was going to get an allowance on marrying him, and a generous one, but that she was not going to inherit anything in addition to that allowance. 3, that her husband's wealth was going to charity, all of it. And 4, that in her estimation, this was the right thing to do, and she was delighted to be his helpmeet in giving away this money. The prenuptial agreement establishes rather conclusively that Carnegie, in 1887, 5 years before Homestead, at a moment in his personal biography when he had no need to rehabilitate his reputation, had already determined to give away his fortune. The answer to why he had made this decision is, I think, found in the voluminous writings of Herbert Spencer. And because I had to read Herbert Spencer, you do not. Herbert Spencer provided Carnegie and other Gilded Age philanthropists with a substitute for social philosophies that said there was something wrong with making wealth, that wealth was the result of immoral exploitation. And it gave Carnegie a substitute for the unforgiving Scottish Calvinism he had grown up with. Spencer's social Darwinism, with its reliance on the laws of evolutionary progress, made sense of the 19th century world Carnegie lived in. The laws of evolutionary progress had decreed, Carnegie extrapolated from Spencer's work. The laws of evolutionary progress had decreed that millions accumulate in his bank accounts. Why? Because the talents which made him a great accumulator would vouchsafe for his wisdom and his skill as a distributor to the community, as a benefactor of the nation, as a philanthropist. Wealth, Carnegie proclaimed with the same surety that characterized the writings of Herbert Spencer, wealth was never the product of an individual, but always of the larger community, the nation. Quote, where wealth accrues honorably, the people are always silent partners. I like to think of Carnegie as following the tradition of Adam Smith, as a moral philosopher of capitalism. Manqué, he didn't quite get there, but he tried. In his own case, that of the Pittsburgh iron and steel manufacturer, Carnegie had succeeded in millions, in large part, and he said this, because his mother had brought him to Pittsburgh in the late 1840s, the right place at the right time. As the American population expanded and moved west, it required railroads. The railroads required iron, then steel. Pittsburgh was geographically blessed at the nexus of the national railroad grid with coking coal and iron ore nearby. Much of the wealth, this is Carnegie talking, that accrued to the iron and steel manufacturers came from these minerals, which were once the public property of the community. Why, quote, should the nation be denied participation in the results, end quote, when the sine qua non of the wealth accumulated was the nation's bountiful resources and, quote, an expanding population engaged in settling a new continent. In bestowing his millions upon the nation, Carnegie was not making a gift, but rather giving back the wealth he held as a trustee to those to whom it rightly belonged, to those who had earned it. For Carnegie, the processes of accumulation and disaccumulation were inseparable. Herbert Spencer had taught him that the laws of evolutionary progress governed the affairs of humankind, and it was these laws that decreed that the fittest, Spencer's words, should aggregate capital so that they could then distribute it to the larger community. He who did not distribute his fortune in his lifetime robbed the community of his talents as a social organizer, as an entrepreneur, as a businessman, as a man who understood the workings of the society that he inhabited. And for that reason alone, the man who died rich died disgraced and had no right to determine what would happen to his wealth after his death. Carnegie advocated, hard word to say, confiscatory inheritance taxes for the wealthy, not because he wanted the government to have any more money to spend. He was a staunch Republican. He did not believe in large government. But he wanted the government to charge 100% inheritance taxes to force the millionaires, the wealthy, to give away their money during their lifetimes. He was a staunch opponent of dynastic fortunes and the power and influence that came with them. Dynastic wealth, he claimed, would be the ruin of America, as it had been the ruin of the British Empire. American capitalism and government would suffer irreparable harm if birth, not merit, determined its future leaders. Though in other matters, Andrew Carnegie prided himself on being a Democrat, with a small d. When it came to his philanthropy, he behaved as autocratically as the English aristocrats he criticized whenever he got the chance. He had no intention of consulting anyone, neither elected officials or community representatives, in deciding how he was going to give away his money. He believed he had every right to make the decisions. Why? Because he was among the fittest. He was compelled, nonetheless, as a pragmatic businessman who wanted his ventures to succeed, to form partnerships with government. Why? Because government controlled more resources than he did, rich as he was, through tax revenues. Carnegie was a genius at using his funds as a lever to pry open government coffers. Because he considered public libraries an essential tool for the education of the community, he used his gifts of library buildings as a bribe to persuade local governments to provide tax levy funding necessary to maintain them in the same way that governments maintain schools, sewers, police departments, firehouses. He insisted, willing to pay for library buildings spacious enough to fit the needs of any community, but only when the elected officials in that community promised in writing to use tax revenues to buy the books, provide the staffing, and the maintenance. He never paid for a book. He never paid for a librarian. In New York City, he added an additional condition to his $5.2 million bequest, worth several billions today, for branch libraries. He didn't build the big library. He wanted branch libraries for the people. He demanded in writing that the city government promise to open the doors of the branch libraries at 9 o'clock in the morning and close them only at 9 at night, to keep them open 6 days a week and on all public holidays. And he left it to the local officials to decide if they wanted to stay open the seventh day. Quote, his real purpose, his associate James Bertram recalled, quote, was not to found libraries himself, but to force the communities to do so. In most of his benefactions, Carnegie attempted to enlist government as a partner. When he determined that the United States needed a pure research institution in Washington, D.C., he offered the federal government $10 million in U.S. steel gold bonds to establish one, and hoped it would be run on the model of the Smithsonian. When he organized the Scottish University Trusts and gave it $10 million to pay the tuition and fees of Scottish university students, the first example I know of open admissions, he appointed to its board of directors the leaders of the Liberal and Conservative parties and made Lord Balfour the cabinet secretary for Scotland, one of the chief officials. When he established the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, funded again with $10 million, he chose as its first president Elihu Root, who happened to be a senator from New York and a member of the Committee on Foreign Relations. His intent in all of this was not to replace or forestall government funding for peace work, culture, education, scientific research in the arts, but to bribe elected officials to broaden their efforts in these directions. The bulk of Carnegie's philanthropic giving was directed for increasing opportunities for those born as he had been without the benefit of family money, family land, businesses, or titles. It was this purpose that William Simon both admired and adopted as the guiding charitable philosophy behind his foundation. The foundation's mission statement elaborates on this purpose by referencing Carnegie's own words from the Gospel of Wealth. And I quote from William Simon in the mission statement for the Simon Foundation, citing Andrew Carnegie. Quote, in bestowing charity, the main consideration should be to help those who will help themselves, to provide part of the means by which those who desire to improve may do so, to give those who desire to rise the aids by which they may rise, to assist, but rarely or never to do all. Carnegie built public libraries for those who could not afford to buy their own books. He built concert halls for those who could not afford to build them in those towns and cities like Dunfermline, Allegheny City, Braddock, Pennsylvania, and Pittsburgh, where there was not enough of a citizen base to build a magnificent concert hall. When asked to build a music hall in New York City, he said, absolutely not. New Yorkers have enough money of their own. He was ultimately persuaded by his wife and his friends that New York City had a lot of money, but no concert hall suitable for the city's two orchestras, the New York Symphony and the Philharmonic, which were two separate orchestras then, and the Oratorio Society. The Metropolitan Opera House, Steinway Hall, Chickering Hall, and the Academy of Music on 14th Street simply did not do for orchestral music. So what did Carnegie do? He organized a stock company to build a new music hall and operate it as a self-sustaining enterprise. He did not give it money. When the company which operated the hall steadfastly refused to turn a profit or even come close to breaking even, Carnegie gave him more money, but only to construct income-producing offices and practice studios, which has resulted in the Carnegie Hall edifice, which is a concert hall, offices, studios, and that was intended so that the hall would break even, because Carnegie was not going to give the people of New York a hall. They could afford one themselves. He was friendly with the presidents of several of the nation's wealthiest, most prestigious, well-endowed universities. Very good friends. He played golf with Butler of Columbia. He went fishing with others. But his large benefactions went to the underfunded Scottish universities, and in this country, to Tuskegee, Hampton, Cooper Union, the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen in New York, which is again also right around the corner, Franklin Union in Philadelphia, Berea College in Kentucky, and the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, later Carnegie Mellon. The one exception to his policy of funding smaller, unendowed institutions was a gift to Princeton University. President Wilson had assiduously wooed Carnegie, following him to Scotland, where he spent a week trailing Carnegie around. Wilson wasn't a good fisherman. He didn't play golf. But he was there to raise money. And he worked really hard at it, and he came up with several proposals which he gave to Carnegie. And what did Carnegie do? He turned every one of them down and built a lake at Princeton. And why did he build a lake? Because he hated American football. And he figured if he built a lake for Princeton, then more young athletes would go out for crew, and football would become less popular. As you can imagine, President Wilson, who had other ideas for the Carnegie money, was not pleased. It has been almost 120 years since Andrew Carnegie published his Gospel of Wealth essays, and in so doing established the basis for what would come to be known as scientific philanthropy. We are, with the recent oversized contributions of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, said to be entering a second golden age of philanthropy. Charitable giving approached $300 billion in 2006, up slightly from the year before. Overall assets in what is now called the third sector, the philanthropic sector, alongside private business and government, assets in this sector are now accounted to be somewhere between $2.5 trillion and $3 trillion, more than double what they were 10 years ago. The poster boy for 21st century philanthropy is Bill Gates. Carnegie would applaud Gates's decision to reinvent himself as a philanthropist, and he would raise high his hat, and usually wore a hat because he was only about 4'11", and he tried to disguise it with high heels and a top hat. He would raise high his hat to Gates, not because Gates has pledged or given away more than $3.5 billion in the last 4 years, almost half his net worth, but because Gates is following in Carnegie's footsteps and adhering to the dictate that the successful businessman is obligated by the laws of evolutionary progress to devote as much time and effort to the process of disaccumulation or distribution as he has to accumulation. And when you listen to Gates talk, it's clear that he's immersed himself in the work of his foundation, and he has pledged that in July 2008 he will step down from his responsibilities at Microsoft to be a full-time manager of his foundation. Gates shares with Carnegie, as well as with the greatest of 20th and 21st century philanthropists, an optimism born of a self-confidence rooted in astounding success in the marketplace. Gates sincerely believes that he and his foundation, through the force of his personal persuasiveness, the spending of billions of dollars, and the hiring of the best possible executives, he sincerely believes that his foundation will play a major role in producing an HIV vaccine and coming closer to eliminating malaria and TB during Gates's lifetime. Let us hope that he is correct. But let us also remember that Carnegie was so convinced of his own powers of persuasion that he believed that he would be able to end the scourge of international war, and he believed that the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace would have to redirect its energies after 5-10 years of work because there would be no more war. Like Carnegie, Gates does not consult with government entities on how he should spend his money, though his language is not nearly as caustically autocratic as Carnegie's was. The first guiding principle of Gates's foundation states plainly that, quote, "This is a family foundation driven by the interests and passions of the Gates family." Gates acknowledges, however, as did Carnegie, that his fortune, though huge, is not large enough to accomplish all that needs to be done. To meet his goals, he has partnered with governments when and where possible, and with NGOs where not. Carnegie recognized that his wealth was insufficient to fund, maintain, staff, and buy books for the almost 3,000 libraries he built. Gates understands, as his COO explained in a speech on November 1st, that even with the wealth and expertise now housed in the Gates Foundation, the foundation will be unable to accomplish any of its goals, without forming partnerships. Quote, as the COO said, "After 10 years, our foundation is convinced that one of the most important how tools available to us is public-private partnerships." A major difference between Carnegie's philanthropic efforts and Gates's is one of focus. Carnegie looked about him and located multiple causes to attend to and inequities to alleviate. His goal was to hasten the transition from the age of barbarism to the age of civilization, to create new opportunities for the working but ambitious poor, and to bring what he called sweetness and light, that's his term, into the lives of those without them. His philanthropy was that of the cultured, conservative, benevolent 19th century secular altruist. His relationship to the community and nation was that of the enlightened Tory landowner to his retainers. He, Andrew Carnegie, would decide what the people needed and direct his overseers to give it to them. Carnegie's role in his philanthropies, as it had been in his steel mills, was that of the absentee landlord who delegated authority and watched over the enterprise from a distance. He designed institutions to meet needs, selected the best men he could find, and left them alone. Well aware that changing historical circumstances might necessitate shifts in giving policy, he wrote into every one of his mission statements the phrase that the directors could change anything in the mission statement. Of course, they didn't while he was alive, and most of them have not substantially after his death, but they had that power, and he was the one who gave it to him. Gates, the prototype of the 21st century philanthropist, is more focused, more in command, more the CEO than the absentee landlord. Like Carnegie, he oversees his philanthropic enterprises much as he did his for-profit ones. He making use of or developing new technologies to solve problems with continuous testing and evaluation of the strategies and the technologies. There was very little scientific method in Carnegie's scientific philanthropy. There's a lot more in Gates's. Carnegie spread his largesse, as I've said, over multiple causes and several institutions. Gates is focused on one foundation and a limited number of specific problems which he intends to solve. Following the path laid out by Julius Rosenwald, but more recently articulated in a philosophy of giving by John Olin and William Simon, Gates has designed his foundation to sunset 50 years after the death of he or his wife. He is not interested in building a permanent institution, nor is he content with rationing spending or restricting it to the 5% required by law. He wants to solve problems, not build an institution that will be self-perpetuating. While Gates has a well-defined strategy for giving away his money, he has never been able or willing to explain why he's giving it away or articulate a larger philanthropic philosophy, other than to resort to cliche and parrot his mother's teaching that, quote, from those to whom much is given, much is respected. His mother didn't say that. It comes from Luke 12:48. But Gates, like all good sons, gives his mother credit. Gates' partner in his philanthropic endeavors is Warren Buffett, the second richest man in the United States. It is as if Rockefeller and Carnegie had joined forces at the turn of the 20th century. Such is the impact of this partnership. Buffett doesn't cite his mother or Luke in explaining his philosophy or the philosophy behind his giving. He refers instead to Carnegie and the notion that the true source of all wealth is the community or nation, not the individual. In a remarkable interview he gave to Fortune magazine in June of 2006, he explained that 54 years earlier, on the eve of his first marriage, he told his wife that he was going to get very, very rich. Quote, this was not going to be because of any special virtues of mine or even because of hard work, but simply because I was born with the right skills in the right place at the right time. He's almost parroting Carnegie's words. I was wired at birth, he says, to allocate capital and was lucky enough to have people around me early on, my parents and teachers and Susie, his first wife, who helped me to make the most of that talent. We agreed with Andrew Carnegie, who said that huge fortunes that flow in large part from society should be returned to society. In my case, the ability to allocate capital would have had little utility unless I lived in a rich, populous country in which enormous quantities of marketable securities were traded and sometimes ridiculously mispriced. So Buffett understood, just as Carnegie had, that he was a creature of his times and his place. Had he been born 20 years earlier, had he been born in some part of the world that did not have a fully developed market, he would have been a successful shopkeeper or high school teacher, not a multi-billionaire. While Carnegie would certainly applaud Buffett's decision to give away nearly 80% of his net worth, while reminding him that he, Carnegie, had given it all away, Carnegie would be aghast at Buffett's decision to absent himself from any decision-making regarding the disposition of his money. Warren Buffett is indeed so rich that he can hire Bill Gates to spend his money for him. But Carnegie would have insisted that he spend it himself. And Carnegie would have believed it criminal of a man as smart as Warren Buffett not to oversee the distribution of his money in the same way he had the accumulation. Though Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have become the face of 21st century philanthropy, much as Carnegie and Rockefeller were for the 20th century, comparisons between these individuals and their goals may not be the best way to understand the changes that have transformed the philanthropic universe. The Philanthropic Center has grown and been democratized beyond all expectation in the past century, fueled by the enormous expansion of American GDP, gross domestic product, the related increase in the number of Americans who have sufficient disposable and liquid assets to give to philanthropy, and the growing size of those disposable assets. And then we must factor in the tax code, and I will get to that in a minute. In 2006, Americans, as I said, gave away $300 billion. But what we don't understand sufficiently is that the foundations sector of philanthropy, and that includes private foundations, family foundations, community foundations, accounted for about 12% of this giving. Corporations accounted for 4% of this giving. Living individuals account for 75% of that $300 billion, and money given by individuals in their wills for the remaining 8%. Obviously, if we want to understand the world of giving today, we must look beyond the good works of the largest foundations and the big philanthropists with their professional staffs to the almost $250 billion given away by estates and individuals, the bulk of it by the 3.1% of high net worth households with incomes greater than $200,000 or assets in excess of $1 million. It is these individuals and their families who determine, without benefit of professional staffs, consultants, or any RFP process, the purposes and institutions they want to fund. The divergence between the recipients of foundation support and individual support are striking. Foundations direct 2.5% of their grants to religious congregations. Individual donors give more than 1/3 of their philanthropic dollars to congregations. And that does not include the donations made to faith-based organizations, schools, universities, hospitals, hospices, healthcare facilities. That is to the congregations themselves. Arts, culture, and the humanities get about 4% of total individual spending. International organizations and disaster relief, under 4%. Education, about 14%. Although it is never easy to quantify, closer scrutiny of individual giving indicates that much, if not most of it, goes to congregations, schools and universities, hospitals and healthcare facilities, museums and parks, which benefit the donors or their families. Individuals are not surprisingly more likely to give to the church or synagogue they or their families or members of their families attend, to their alma maters, the children's private schools, and the arts and cultural institutions they patronize. To bring the matter closer to home, those who live near Central Park are more likely to give money to the Central Park Conservancy than to Rufus King Park in Jamaica. They're more likely to give money to the Metropolitan Museum or the Metropolitan Opera than to the Queen Symphony or the Jamaica Culture Collaborative in Southeast Queens. And there's nothing wrong with this. I am not criticizing this. I'm simply calling attention to it. There's nothing wrong with it, though it is not what Carnegie had in mind when he wrote his Gospel of Wealth essays, or William Simon had in mind when, following Carnegie's example, he declared that the principal goal of his philanthropy was to help poor and needy people to help themselves. Again, we must not condemn or look askance at 21st century giving for not following in their footsteps. But if we agree with the founders of modern philanthropy and their successors, we might ask what can be done to direct more giving towards the commendable ends that Carnegie articulates and Simon reiterates. Carnegie, we must remember, gave away his money at a time when there were neither income nor inheritance taxes, and hence no incentive to maximize charitable deductions. The landscape of giving has changed enormously in the past century, and a significant force behind some of that change, a significant part of that change, I might argue, has been the tax code. Does anyone doubt that the imposition of income and estate taxes, coupled with the availability of the charitable deductions, has not had a direct effect on giving? And if that is the case, might not some tinkering with the tax code focus giving in ways that might better benefit the society as a whole without reducing the freedom of individuals to give as they wish to causes of their own choosing? From left and right, there have been calls for rethinking and revising the rules for charitable deductions. Former Secretary of the Treasury Robert Reich, who claims that only about 10% of total charitable giving goes to the poor and needy, suggests that we eliminate the charitable deductions for all donations save those that directly benefit the poor. A gift to the Salvation Army or disaster relief would be tax deductible, but not one to Harvard or the Metropolitan Opera. Iowa Republican Senator Charles Grassley advocates reviewing and possibly rescinding the billions of dollars in tax breaks that nonprofit hospitals receive. Until and unless those hospitals demonstrate that they provide the larger community, including the poor, with, quote, significant measurable benefits. This is Grassley speaking. Grassley has also long been a fierce advocate for ending the many allowable abuses of the charitable deduction. His favorite one for a time was the full deduction for the cost of safaris as long as the hunters donated part of their dead animal trophies to museums. They would then get a full charitable deduction for the entire cost of the safari. I won't pretend I have any answers here, but I wish merely channeling the spirit of the founder of scientific philanthropy, Andrew Carnegie, to raise questions. I make no apologies if these questions complicate our understanding of the philanthropic universe of the 21st century. With all of you, again, I applaud the generosity of ordinary Americans, rich and poor who give money. But when we look beyond these individuals to the philanthropic enterprise as a $300 billion whole, we may find that the glass is only 2/3 full. While Bill Clinton, in his recent disaster of a book, imaginatively entitled Giving, is relentlessly upbeat about American generosity and his and Hillary's role in promoting philanthropic causes, the reality is far different. There have been increases in the aggregate dollar amounts donated to philanthropy in recent years, but only because the GNP and the GDP have grown. The percentage of money going to charity and to the philanthropic sector has held steady at about 2% of GNP, or declined. The percentage of incomes over $1 million that go to philanthropic causes fell to 3.6% in the last year that it's been measured, 2003. The percentage of wealth given to charity by estates worth more than $1 million declined from 8.8% 10 years ago to 7.9% in 2004. The percentage of $1 million plus estates that gave away nothing reached 78.1% in 2004, and it's been climbing. Over half of the states in the $20 million plus area allocated nothing to charity. According to Fortune magazine this year, when it comes time for the rich to die, these are their words, not mine. I wouldn't be so crass. When it comes time for the rich to die, about 9% of their assets go to charitable causes. Pets get about 2%. Those of us who write or think or engage in philanthropic enterprises cannot afford to be as blissfully ignorant as Bill Clinton of the larger realities, or as Bill Clinton professed to be in his giving book of the larger realities. He's got to be smarter than he pretended to be in that book. Celebration of American generosity is always in order, but so too is careful scrutiny. Our task is, first of all, to decide whether we're content with this current situation, and if not, what can we do to improve it? Should we, as a nation, take a serious look at the tax code and its effect on giving? Should we, as educators, intellectuals, and citizens, find a way to provide education, moral and practical, to individuals and businesses, rich and poor, so that they can increase their giving and maximize the social benefits of their gifts? Should we focus more of our attention on encouraging the kinds of public-private partnerships that Carnegie put his efforts into? Should we encourage foundations to follow the examples of William Simon and Bill Gates and spend more of their assets than the annual 5% for administration and donations now required by law? There is obviously a great deal to be done before the cup of philanthropic giving is filled to the brim. And I thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Nasaw. I'd just like to recognize a couple people here from the Simon Foundation: Jim Pearson, Sheila Mulcahy. And please join me again in thanking David Nasaw.